Margaret stole from us. My father said at the Thanksgiving table, and for a moment the entire room went silent in the way rooms only do when something is so unexpected that nobody knows how to react. I still remember the smell of roasted turkey and sage stuffing hanging in the warm air, the kind of comforting smell that usually means family and laughter, but that night it felt heavy, like the walls themselves were listening. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring down at the white tablecloth as if the pattern in the fabric suddenly mattered more than anything else in the room. My younger sister Emily sat across from me with her husband Jason, and neither of them looked surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. Everyone else looked shocked, confused, maybe even a little embarrassed. But Emily looked calm. Calm in a way that told me this moment had been rehearsed long before I stepped through the front door. The dining room in my parents' house had always been the center of every holiday. A big oak table my father bought nearly 30 years ago when he started his construction business. Every Thanksgiving we filled those chairs with family, friends, and more food than anyone could reasonably eat. I had driven almost 2 hours that afternoon through steady November traffic just to be there, bringing a pumpkin pie from the bakery near my apartment because my mother always said they made the best crust in the county. Now that pie was sitting untouched in the middle of the table while my own father accused me of stealing from him. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around the room slowly, letting the moment stretch just long enough for everyone to realize that something had shifted. My father cleared his throat like he expected me to start apologizing immediately. "The bank records don't lie," he added, his voice firm, the same tone he used when I was a kid and had broken curfew. "Money from the family trust disappeared last week, and your name is on the withdrawal." My mother finally looked up, her eyes full of worry, but she still didn't say a word. Jason leaned back in his chair, watching like this was some kind of quiet entertainment. Emily reached for her wine glass and took a small sip, still avoiding my eyes. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a setup, a careful little stage built in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. I felt my purse resting against the side of my chair and slipped my hand inside it. The envelope was still there, exactly where I had placed it earlier that afternoon before leaving my apartment. Thick cream-colored paper, sealed neatly, the edges perfectly straight. I pulled it out slowly and placed it on the table in front of me without opening it. The room grew even quieter. My father frowned. Emily stopped lifting her glass halfway to her lips. I folded my hands calmly on top of the envelope and looked back at my father. "You're right," I said quietly. "The bank records don't lie." For the first time that evening, Emily's expression changed. Just slightly. Just enough for me to know that whatever she thought was about to happen next wasn't going to go the way she planned. For several seconds no one moved. The only sound in the dining room was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint rattle of dishes as the heat vent clicked on under the window. My father stared at the envelope in front of me as if it were some strange object that did not belong on his table. He had always been a man who expected quick answers and simple explanations, the kind of person who believed that if he raised his voice, just a little people would fall into line. But this time I did not rush to defend myself. I simply sat there, hands folded, watching the expressions around the table change one by one. My mother finally spoke, her voice careful and quiet. She asked me if I was going to say anything about what my father had just accused me of. I noticed she did not say that she believed him. She only asked if I had something to say. That was the way my mother had always handled conflict. She stepped slightly to the side and waited to see which direction the wind would blow. I looked at her for a moment and then back at my father. The overhead light reflected off the polished oak surface of the table, the same table where my parents had celebrated birthdays, graduations, and every Thanksgiving since I was a teenager. For years I had believed that table represented something permanent. Family, loyalty, shared history. Tonight it felt like a courtroom. My father leaned forward and placed both hands on the table. He said that the bank had confirmed the withdrawal came from the Collins family trust, and that the transaction had been authorized under my name. He said that the bank had shown him the paperwork that morning. According to him, there was only one explanation. The money had disappeared, and I was the one who took it. He spoke slowly, carefully, like a man presenting a final argument. Across the table, Emily tilted her head slightly, watching me with a small expression that might have passed for concern if you did not know her as well as I did. But I knew Emily. I had known her all my life. I knew the difference between her real concern and the quiet satisfaction she tried to hide when things went exactly the way she wanted. Jason cleared his throat and shifted in his chair, glancing from my father to me and then back to the envelope again. Even the turkey in the center of the table seemed forgotten, the steam from the platter fading slowly into the air. I rested my fingertips lightly against the edge of the envelope, but still did not open it. Instead, I asked my father a simple question. I asked him when he first noticed the money was missing. He frowned as if the question irritated him. He said the bank had called him 2 days earlier to confirm a large transfer and that he immediately knew something was wrong because he had not approved any withdrawals that week. That was when he looked at the paperwork and saw my name. My name written clearly on the authorization line. My mother inhaled sharply when he said it again, as if hearing it out loud made the accusation heavier. Emily finally set her glass down on the table. She told my father that perhaps I had made a mistake, and that maybe there was some explanation I had not told them yet. But her voice sounded rehearsed, like someone repeating a line she had practiced in front of a mirror. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room watching me, waiting for panic or anger or some desperate attempt to deny what had been said. Instead, I looked down at the envelope again and then back at my father. I told him that the bank had called me too. And when I said that, Emily stopped breathing for just a moment. I could see the moment my words reached her. Emily's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass so quickly that the small crystal ring it made against the table sounded much louder than it should have in that quiet room. My father blinked once, confused, as if the story he had prepared in his mind had suddenly shifted in a direction he had not planned for. My mother looked back and forth between us, her eyes moving the way they did when she sensed something in the room she did not yet understand. I kept my voice calm. I told them that the bank had called me early Tuesday morning, just after 9 o'clock, while I was making coffee in my kitchen before leaving for work. The call came from the branch downtown, where our family trust had been managed for more than 15 years. The manager had asked if I could come in because there was something unusual about a transaction connected to my name. I remember standing there beside the counter in my small apartment, looking out the window at the gray November sky, while he explained that a significant amount of money had been transferred from the trust account. At first, I assumed there had been a mistake. I told him that I had not visited the bank recently and that I had not signed any authorization forms. That was when his voice changed slightly. Not alarmed, just careful. He said the paperwork included my name clearly printed and a signature that appeared to match the one they had on file. My father leaned back in his chair now, his expression shifting from certainty to confusion. He asked me why I had not called him immediately if the bank had contacted me. I told him that I had intended to understand the situation before accusing anyone of anything. The room grew still again. Jason folded his arms across his chest, watching me closely now instead of casually. My mother asked what the bank manager wanted when he asked me to come in. I told her he wanted me to review the documents in person. I described the office at the bank, the quiet carpeted hallway, and the small conference room where the manager placed a thin folder in front of me. Inside were copies of the withdrawal authorization forms and the transfer records from the trust account. My name was printed clearly across the top line, exactly the way my father said. But the signature at the bottom did not belong to me. I had written my name thousands of times over the years, and I knew every curve and angle of it. What was on that paper looked similar, but it was not mine. I paused then, letting the silence settle again around the table the same way it had in that conference room 2 days earlier. My father asked if I told the bank that immediately. I nodded. I told him I explained to the manager that the signature was not mine and that I had never authorized any withdrawal from the trust. The manager had listened quietly and then said something that made the entire situation very different from what any of us expected. I looked slowly around the table again, letting my eyes pass over my mother, my father, and finally Emily. Then I said that the bank had something else besides the paperwork. Something they had not mentioned during the phone call. Something they only showed me after I arrived. Emily did not move, but the color in her face faded just slightly as she stared at the envelope resting under my hands. My father asked what the bank had shown me, and for a moment I did not answer. Instead, I slid the envelope slightly forward across the polished oak table, just enough for everyone to notice it again. The paper made a soft sound as it moved against the wood. That small sound seemed to echo through the room. My mother's eyes followed the envelope as if it were something fragile. Jason leaned forward a little in his chair now, curiosity replacing the casual confidence he had earlier. Emily still had not touched her glass again. I told them that when I finished explaining to the bank manager that the signature on the withdrawal form was not mine, he nodded and said that he understood. He told me situations like this were rare, but not impossible, and that sometimes the only way to understand what happened was to look at the full record of the transaction. He then opened a second folder on the table and turned the papers toward me. Inside were printed images taken from the bank's security cameras. Every customer who entered the building passed through those cameras. Every transaction window was recorded from more than one angle. The bank had kept those records for years. My father frowned as I spoke, trying to follow the story now instead of leading it. My mother pressed her hands together more tightly in her lap. I told them that the first photograph showed the front doors of the branch at 2:17 in the afternoon last Friday. A woman walked through those doors carrying a tan leather handbag and wearing a dark coat. The second image showed her standing in line at the customer service counter. The third image showed her handing a form to the teller. The bank manager had placed the photographs side by side so that I could see the sequence clearly. He had not said anything while I studied them. He simply waited for me to recognize what was in front of me. I remember staring at those photographs for several seconds before the realization settled in. At first it felt almost unreal, like seeing a familiar face in a place where it should not exist. I looked up from the pictures and asked the manager if those images had been taken from the exact time of the withdrawal. He confirmed that they had. The timestamp matched the authorization form perfectly. My father asked what that had to do with the money missing from the trust. His voice was slower now, the sharp certainty gone from it. I looked at him and then at my mother, and finally I let my eyes rest on Emily again. She had become very still in her chair, the way people do when they are trying not to draw attention to themselves. I told my father that the bank did not accuse anyone when they showed me those photographs. They only wanted to verify whether the person in the images was actually me. I paused then and rested my hand on the envelope again. I said that I told the manager the truth immediately. I told him that the woman standing at the counter in those photographs was not me. And when I said that, my father leaned forward and asked the question that had been hanging in the room since the beginning of the evening. He asked who it was. I let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone at the table to feel the weight of it. Then I said quietly that the person in the photographs looked exactly like someone sitting at this table tonight. No one spoke after I said that. The quiet in the dining room felt different now, heavier and sharper, as if every person at the table had suddenly realized the evening was no longer following the story they had expected. My father looked around the table slowly, his eyes moving from my mother to Jason and finally stopping on Emily. He did not say her name, but the question in his expression was impossible to miss. Emily gave a small laugh that sounded thin and uncertain. She said that this was ridiculous and asked why I was telling strange stories instead of simply explaining where the money went. Her voice carried a hint of irritation now, but it was the kind of irritation that appears when someone feels the ground beginning to shift under their feet. I kept my hands resting calmly on the envelope. I told them that when the bank manager showed me the photographs, he asked a very simple question. He asked whether the woman in the images was me. I told him immediately that it was not. The manager then asked if I recognized the person at all. I explained that I did. I told him that the woman in the photographs looked remarkably like my younger sister. Across the table, Emily's shoulders stiffened, but she forced another quick smile, as if the suggestion were so absurd that it barely deserved a response. She said the lighting in security cameras can make anyone look like anyone else. Jason nodded beside her and added that grainy photographs could easily be misinterpreted. My father remained silent, but the certainty he had shown earlier was fading from his face. My mother asked quietly if the bank manager believed the photographs proved anything. I told her that the manager did not accuse anyone directly. Banks rarely do. Instead, he said that when a transaction becomes questionable, they review every piece of available information before taking the next step. That includes paperwork, signatures, timestamps, and camera footage. He explained that the withdrawal from the trust account had taken place at exactly 2:24 in the afternoon last Friday. The photographs showed the woman arriving 7 minutes earlier, waiting briefly in line, and then speaking with the teller. The timing matched the transaction perfectly. I could see my father thinking through the details now, the way he always did when he was trying to rebuild a timeline in his mind. Emily leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. She asked if I expected everyone at the table to believe that she walked into a bank and pretended to be me. Her voice had grown sharper, but she still avoided looking directly at the envelope. I told her that the bank manager had asked the same question. He wanted to know whether I had any explanation for why someone who looked like my sister appeared at the exact time the withdrawal was made. I explained that I told him the truth. I said that I did not know why she would do that. But I also told him something else. I told him that the paperwork for the withdrawal contained a signature that was meant to resemble mine, but it was not identical. There were small differences in the way certain letters curved. Differences that someone who studied my signature closely might try to copy, but would never reproduce perfectly. Emily's calm expression began to fade now. Jason shifted again in his chair and glanced at her for a moment before looking away. My father slowly placed both hands flat on the table, his attention fixed on me again. He asked if the bank had given me copies of the photographs and documents. I nodded and gently tapped the envelope beneath my hands. I told him that everything the bank manager showed me that morning was right here. The envelope remained on the table between my hands, and for a long moment no one reached for it. My father studied it, as if the thin layer of paper might suddenly reveal everything without being opened. I could see the calculation in his expression now, the careful way he was replaying the last few days in his mind. He had built his accusation on certainty, on the belief that the documents from the bank pointed only in one direction. Now that certainty was beginning to crack. My mother finally spoke again, her voice softer than before. She asked if the bank had told me anything else after showing me the photographs. I nodded slowly. I told her the manager had explained that whenever a transaction is disputed, the bank must follow a very specific process. First, they gather all available records. Then they confirm the identity of the person who authorized the transaction. Only after that do they decide whether the withdrawal was legitimate. He had been very calm when he said it, the way professionals are when they deal with complicated situations every day. I told them that he also asked me another question while we sat in that conference room. He asked whether anyone else in the family might have had access to information about the trust account. My father looked surprised by that. For years he had managed most of the financial decisions himself, but there were certain details that everyone in the family knew. The account existed to help maintain the house and to support my parents as they grew older. The paperwork had been discussed more than once during family gatherings. I explained that I told the manager several people were aware of the trust, including Emily. My sister immediately shook her head and said that knowing about the account did not mean she had anything to do with the withdrawal. Her tone had grown sharper now, the calm confidence from earlier replaced by something more defensive. Jason shifted beside her again and said that this conversation was turning into an accusation without proof. I agreed with him. I said that accusations without proof rarely help anyone understand the truth. That was exactly why I did not confront anyone immediately after leaving the bank. Instead, I spent the next 2 days reviewing everything the manager had given me. Copies of the withdrawal form, timestamps from the teller station, still images from the cameras positioned near the entrance and the counter. The more I looked at them, the clearer the sequence became. My father asked if the bank believed a crime had occurred. His voice carried a new edge of concern now. I told him the manager had not used that word. He simply said the situation raised serious questions that needed to be answered. That was when he placed the copies of the photographs and the paperwork into a large envelope and handed it to me. He told me I should review everything carefully before deciding what to do next. I remember holding that envelope in my hands as I walked out of the bank that morning, realizing how easily a single misunderstanding could tear a family apart if it was not handled carefully. I looked back down at the envelope resting on the table now and gently turned it so that the sealed edge faced my father. I told him that everything I had seen in that conference room was inside this envelope. Every photograph, every document, every detail the bank had recorded. And before anyone at the table said another word, I wanted them to understand something very clearly. The truth about what happened last Friday afternoon was already written on those pages. My words settled over the table like a slow winter fog, and for a moment nobody seemed willing to disturb the quiet that followed. My father looked at the envelope again, but this time there was hesitation in his expression, the kind of hesitation that appears when certainty begins to unravel. Earlier that evening he had spoken with absolute confidence, convinced the documents from the bank pointed directly at me. Now that confidence was fading, replaced by something more careful. My mother glanced toward Emily, then quickly backed down at the tablecloth, as if she were afraid that looking too long might reveal something she did not want to see. Emily shifted slightly in her chair and gave a small, dismissive laugh, but the sound carried none of the calm assurance she had shown earlier. She said that photographs and paperwork could be misunderstood, and that anyone who wanted to create confusion could easily do so. Jason nodded beside her and added that banks sometimes made mistakes when reviewing transactions. His tone sounded casual, but I could hear the strain behind it now. I listened to them quietly before responding. I told them that the bank manager had explained something very important during our meeting. Modern banks rarely rely on only one piece of evidence when reviewing a disputed transaction. They compare several layers of information: the authorization form, the teller record, the timestamp from the computer system, and of course the security cameras. All of those pieces had been reviewed together. I remembered sitting in that conference room while the manager spread the documents across the table one by one. The withdrawal form showed the amount transferred from the trust account. The teller record confirmed the exact minute the request was processed, and the security photographs showed the person who had been standing at the counter during that same minute. My father leaned forward slightly when I said that, as if he were trying to hold on to the last piece of the explanation. He asked whether the bank had already decided what happened. I told him that the manager had not made any final decision yet. Instead, he told me that when the person whose name appears on a transaction claims the signature is not genuine, the bank must document everything carefully before taking further action. That was why he gave me copies of every record connected to the withdrawal. Emily crossed her arms tightly now, her earlier confidence slipping away little by little. She said that if the bank believed the transaction was suspicious, they should contact the person responsible instead of letting me bring the matter into a family dinner. I agreed with her that the truth should be addressed directly. That was exactly why I came tonight prepared. I rested my fingertips lightly on the envelope again and looked around the table at each face in turn. My father, who only an hour earlier believed he had uncovered a betrayal. My mother, who seemed torn between fear and disbelief. Jason, watching carefully but saying less than before. And Emily, who had begun to avoid looking at the envelope entirely. I told them that before the bank moved forward with their investigation, they wanted to confirm one final detail. The manager asked me whether I could identify the person in the photographs beyond any doubt. I paused there, remembering the moment clearly, the quiet room at the bank and the photographs spread across the table in front of me. Then I looked directly at Emily and said that after studying the images carefully, I told the bank manager that I was absolutely certain about who that person was. The room felt smaller after I said that. Not physically smaller, but the way a space changes when everyone inside it suddenly realizes that something important is about to happen. My father did not speak right away. He simply stared at me, trying to measure the meaning behind my words. My mother slowly lifted her eyes from the table and looked toward Emily again, this time longer than before. Emily shifted in her chair and forced a quick smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She said that this entire story sounded dramatic and unnecessary. According to her, anyone who looked vaguely similar on a security camera could be mistaken for someone else. Jason nodded in agreement and said that low-resolution photographs were hardly reliable evidence. I listened to them both without interrupting. When they finished, I folded my hands calmly over the envelope again and told them that the bank manager had considered that possibility as well. In fact, that was the very first question he asked when we sat down together. He said that cameras sometimes distort faces slightly, depending on lighting and distance. That was why the bank never relied on only one image. Instead, they reviewed the full sequence recorded by the security system from the moment the customer entered the building until the moment the transaction was completed. I explained that the photographs I mentioned earlier were only still frames taken from a longer video recording. The manager had shown me the video on a screen inside his office. It began with the front doors of the branch opening and someone stepping inside at exactly 2:17 in the afternoon. The camera angle clearly showed the person removing a pair of sunglasses and placing them in a handbag before walking toward the counter. My father leaned forward again when I said that, his expression tightening as he tried to follow every detail. I told them that the recording continued as the person waited in line behind two other customers. During those few minutes, the camera captured several clear views of her face from different angles. She adjusted her hair once, checked her phone, and then stepped forward when the teller called her. None of those movements were rushed or hidden. Everything happened in plain view. Emily shifted again beside Jason, this time pushing her chair slightly closer to the table as if she were trying to regain control of the conversation. She said that even if the bank believed the person in the video looked like her, that still did not prove she had done anything wrong. I agreed that appearances alone do not prove anything. That was why the manager asked me to watch the recording carefully and confirm whether I recognized the person beyond a simple resemblance. I remembered sitting there in that quiet office while the video played a second time. The manager paused the screen several times so I could look closely at the details. The handbag, the coat, the way the person tucked a strand of hair behind her ear while waiting in line. Small habits that might seem ordinary to anyone else, but not to someone who had known that person their entire life. I told the manager that I did not need to watch the recording again. I was already certain. Back at the table, I looked directly at Emily and spoke slowly so every word was clear. I said that the woman standing at the bank counter that afternoon was not someone who merely resembled my sister. It was my sister. The words seemed to stop the air in the room. Emily did not speak immediately. She simply stared at me as if she expected the statement to collapse under its own weight. My father looked from me to her and then back again, his face slowly losing the last traces of the certainty he carried at the beginning of the evening. My mother lifted one hand to her mouth, the gesture small but unmistakable. Jason shifted in his chair and cleared his throat, but he did not interrupt. Emily finally laughed, though the sound was sharp and hollow. She said that I was making a serious accusation and that security footage from a bank camera was not enough to prove anything. She said people see what they want to see when they are already convinced of something. I nodded calmly and told her that was exactly why the bank had taken several additional steps before contacting anyone else about the transaction. The manager explained that when a disputed withdrawal involves a family trust account, the bank must document every element of the transaction carefully. That includes verifying identification presented at the counter. My father frowned slightly when I said that and asked what identification had to do with the situation. I told him that every withdrawal from the trust required a valid form of identification before the teller could process the paperwork. The person at the counter had presented a driver license when the withdrawal form was handed over. The teller recorded that information in the transaction log, just as they were required to do with every large transfer. Emily crossed her arms tightly now and said that if someone had tried to impersonate me, they could easily have used a fake name or another document. I agreed that impersonation sometimes happens, but the manager had already reviewed that possibility. According to the bank's record, the identification presented at the counter belonged to someone whose name was already listed in the family's trust documentation as a relative. My father leaned back slowly in his chair when I said that. The realization was beginning to form in his mind even before the words were fully spoken. Jason glanced toward Emily again, but this time she did not look back at him. She stared straight ahead at the table as if the polished wood had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the room. I told them that the teller had entered the identification information into the system before completing the withdrawal. That record was printed on the same page as the transaction details. I gently tapped the envelope again and explained that the manager had included a copy of that record along with the photographs and the authorization form. My mother asked quietly what name appeared on that identification record. I did not answer right away. Instead, I slid the envelope slightly closer to the center of the table so everyone could see it clearly. The room remained completely silent. Then I said that the identification presented at the bank counter last Friday afternoon belonged to Emily Collins. The moment I said her name, Emily pushed her chair back slightly from the table, the wooden legs scraping softly against the floor. It was not a dramatic movement, just a small shift, but everyone noticed it. My father did not speak for several seconds. He looked at Emily in the slow, searching way people do when they are trying to understand whether the person in front of them is the same one they thought they knew. My mother's eyes moved between the two of us, confusion and disbelief written clearly across her face. Emily shook her head almost immediately and said that the entire situation was absurd. She said that if the bank recorded her name, it must have been some type of clerical mistake, because she had never withdrawn money from the trust account. Jason nodded quickly beside her. and said banks sometimes attach the wrong identification information to transactions when employees are rushed. I listened to them quietly before speaking again. I told them that the manager had anticipated that exact response. That was why he had not relied only on the identification record. He also reviewed the digital log connected to the teller station. Every action performed by the teller was recorded by the system, including the moment the identification card was scanned into the computer. The manager showed me that record as well. It confirmed that the license presented at the counter had been scanned directly into the system before the withdrawal form was processed. My father's expression tightened as he heard that. He asked if the bank had a copy of the scanned license. I nodded and gently lifted one corner of the envelope with my fingertips. I told him that the system automatically stores a digital image of any identification scanned during a large transaction. That image had been printed and placed in the folder along with the rest of the documents. My mother whispered Emily's name softly, almost like a question she was afraid to ask out loud. Emily responded quickly, saying that anyone could have used a copy of her license or taken her information without her knowledge. Her voice was louder now, sharper than before, but the confidence she had earlier was gone. The room had become too quiet for anyone to pretend this was still a simple misunderstanding. I looked at her calmly and told her that the manager had asked about that possibility as well. Identity theft sometimes involves stolen documents or copied information, but there is usually one detail that reveals the difference between a stranger and the actual person. Small personal habits, familiar gestures, the kind of movements that security cameras capture without people realizing it. My father asked what I meant by that. I explained that the bank video showed the woman at the counter reaching into her handbag before handing the withdrawal form to the teller. She pulled out a folded sheet of paper and smoothed it carefully against the counter with both hands. The paper appeared to be a reference note, likely containing the exact trust account number and the amount to withdraw. The camera angle was clear enough to capture something else as well. On the inside of the woman's wrist, just above the watch she was wearing, there was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. I slowly looked at Emily's hands resting on the table. Everyone else followed my gaze. Emily instinctively pulled her sleeve down over her wrist the moment she realized what I was looking at. Emily's hand moved quickly to the cuff of her sleeve the moment she realized where everyone was looking. It was a small reaction, almost instinctive, but it happened too fast to ignore. My father noticed it immediately. His eyes dropped to her wrist and then returned to her face with a kind of slow disbelief I had never seen from him before. For years he had been the person in our family who believed he could read people clearly. He built his business on that belief, trusting his instincts about partners and contracts. Now he was sitting across from his own daughter realizing that instinct had failed him tonight. My mother whispered Emily's name again, but this time it was not a question. It sounded more like a quiet plea for an explanation that might somehow make the situation less painful. Emily kept her sleeve pulled down and shook her head again, but the movement was weaker than before. She said that a birthmark meant nothing and that I was trying to twist ordinary details into evidence. Jason finally leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the table as if he wanted to slow the conversation down before it went any further. He said that the entire discussion had gone far enough, and that if there was confusion about the bank transaction, it should be handled privately instead of turning into an accusation during a family dinner. I looked at him calmly and told him that I agreed about one thing. Accusations should never be made without evidence. That was exactly why I had not said anything when my father first called me earlier in the week. When he phoned me Tuesday morning, he sounded convinced that the bank had already solved the mystery. He told me the paperwork pointed directly to my name and that he expected an explanation when I arrived for Thanksgiving dinner. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone while he spoke, realizing that someone had already decided the story before I had even seen the documents myself. My father shifted in his chair when I said that, his expression tightening slightly as he remembered the conversation. I told him that I could have defended myself immediately during that call, but I chose not to. Instead, I drove to the bank the next morning and reviewed every detail carefully. That was when I understood something important. The truth in situations like this rarely hides in dramatic moments. It hides in quiet details. A timestamp on a computer log, a photograph from a security camera, a familiar gesture someone does without thinking. My mother looked down at Emily's wrist again and then slowly back at me. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she asked what the bank intended to do now that the information had been reviewed. I gently slid the envelope closer to my father, so it rested directly in front of him. The paper made that same soft sound against the table as before. I told her that the manager explained the next step would depend on whether the family could clarify the situation themselves before the bank moved forward with a formal investigation. Then I looked directly at Emily again and spoke in the same calm voice I had used all evening. I said that before the bank took any further action, they would want to know one simple thing. Why Emily Collins walked into that branch last Friday afternoon with the trust account number written on a piece of paper. Emily did not answer right away. The question seemed to settle over the table like a weight that no one wanted to touch. My father looked at her with an expression that had changed completely from the one he wore earlier that evening. The certainty that once pointed at me had disappeared, replaced by a quiet, uneasy realization that the story he believed might have been built on the wrong assumption. My mother sat very still, her hands folded tightly together as if she were holding them in place. Jason glanced between Emily and my father, clearly aware that whatever happened next could not be undone. Emily finally took a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. For the first time since the conversation began, she looked directly at the envelope instead of avoiding it. She said that the situation had become exaggerated and that everyone was drawing conclusions before hearing the full explanation. Her voice was steadier now, though not nearly as confident as before. She said that yes, she had visited the bank last Friday afternoon, but she had not intended to steal anything from the trust account. According to her, she had only gone there to ask a question about whether the account could be used to help cover some urgent expenses she and Jason were dealing with. My father's eyes narrowed slightly as he listened. He asked what kind of expenses required a visit to the bank without telling anyone in the family first. Emily hesitated before answering. She said that she and Jason had recently faced several unexpected bills connected to repairs on their home, and she believed the family trust might allow a temporary withdrawal if the funds were later replaced. Jason shifted beside her, but did not interrupt. My mother asked quietly why she had not discussed that idea with the rest of the family before going to the bank. Emily responded that she did not want to create unnecessary worry until she understood the rules surrounding the account. I listened carefully before speaking again. I told her that asking questions at the bank would have required nothing more than a conversation with the manager. There would have been no need to complete a withdrawal form, no need to present identification, and certainly no need to provide the exact account number written on a piece of paper. The room fell silent again. Emily's explanation had created a small opening, but the details did not fit the record the bank had shown me. My father looked slowly from Emily to the envelope in front of him. The meaning of everything we had discussed was beginning to settle in. I gently placed my hand on the envelope once more and slid it the final few inches toward him. I told him that the photographs, the transaction records, and the identification scan were all inside. The bank had documented everything carefully. I said that the manager made it very clear that once a disputed withdrawal is reported, the institution must follow strict procedures to determine what actually occurred. My father rested his hand on the envelope, but did not open it yet. He looked across the table at Emily again, searching her face for something that might change the story one more time. But Emily did not speak. The room was quiet enough that the ticking of the kitchen clock could be heard from the hallway. And in that silence, everyone at the table understood that the truth was already sitting there in plain sight. My father kept his hand resting on the envelope for several seconds before finally lifting it from the table. The paper made a quiet rustling sound as he turned it over and studied the sealed edge, as if he were hoping the answers inside might somehow change if he waited long enough. The rest of the room remained completely silent. Even Emily did not speak now. Whatever explanation she had tried to offer earlier had dissolved under the weight of the details we had already uncovered. Slowly, my father opened the envelope and slid the documents onto the table. The photographs appeared first, followed by the transaction record and the printed scan of the identification card. He looked at each page carefully, his expression tightening with every new detail. My mother leaned slightly closer so she could see as well. The security images showed the bank lobby, the line of customers, and finally the moment the woman at the counter handed the paperwork to the teller. The timestamp was printed clearly in the corner of every frame. My father's eyes moved back and forth between the photograph and Emily sitting across from him. For years he had believed that family loyalty meant trusting the people closest to him without question. Tonight that belief was being tested in a way none of us had expected. My mother finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. She asked Emily if there was anything she wanted to say before the situation moved any further. Emily stared at the table for a long moment before answering. When she finally looked up, the confidence she carried earlier that evening had disappeared completely. She said that she never intended for things to unfold the way they had. She explained that the repairs on their home had cost far more than they expected, and she had convinced herself that borrowing money from the trust temporarily would not cause harm if she returned it later. She admitted that she knew the family would likely refuse if she asked directly, and that fear led her to make a decision she believed she could quietly fix afterward. My father listened without interrupting, though the disappointment in his expression was impossible to hide. He placed the documents back into the envelope slowly and folded his hands together on the table. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then he looked at me, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it before, and told me he should never have accused me without first hearing my side of the story. I nodded gently, not because the apology erased what had happened, but because the truth had finally replaced the assumption that started this entire evening. Outside the window, the November night had settled over the neighborhood, and the lights from nearby houses flickered through the trees. The Thanksgiving dinner we planned never truly happened. The food on the table had grown cold, and the celebration everyone expected had turned into something far more difficult. Yet as I watched my father carefully slide the envelope closed again, I realized something important. Families often believe trust is automatic simply because people share the same name. But trust, like truth, only survives when people are willing to face what is real instead of what is convenient to believe.